The first thing people noticed wasn't the sirens. It wasn't the state vehicles crawling up the long dirt road toward the Whittaker home. It wasn't even the strangers stepping out in official jackets, holding clipboards and sealed envelopes. It was the silence. For a family known for noise, the barking sounds Ray made when startled, the rhythmic rocking of Lorraine's chair, the heavy footsteps of Timmy pacing across the porch, that sudden silence felt wrong. It was the kind of quiet that falls before something irreversible happens, the kind that presses against your stomach and warns you there is no going back. And standing just beyond the fence, watching it unfold with a strange combination of distance and familiarity, was the man who triggered it all, Eric Carroll. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He didn't even move as the state officials approached the door. He just watched. And later, when he was confronted, when people demanded to know why he had done it, why he had torn apart a family already so fragile, he finally said the words that stunned everyone. I didn't have a choice. If I didn't make the call, everything would have come back on me. Until that moment, the public had been fed a very different story. They were told the separation was necessary, urgent, unavoidable. They were told that the three vulnerable adults, Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine, were in danger and needed immediate state intervention. They were told that Eric was acting out of responsibility, compassion, and moral duty. But his confession revealed something else entirely. Something heavier. Something that sounded a lot more like panic than protection. Behind his voice was a truth he never wanted to say out loud. Removing them wasn't an act of rescue. It was an act of survival. His own. The Whittaker story had been quietly collapsing for months before the state ever arrived. That collapse didn't begin with violence or new threats. It didn't begin with a sudden decline in living conditions or a dramatic health emergency. It began with scrutiny, the kind that grows and spreads and sharpens every detail. It started with donors asking questions about where their money had gone. People who once celebrated Eric now demanded receipts. They wanted proof that the thousands raised in the Whittakers' name had actually reached the family. They wanted to see the renovations, the improvements, the promised new home. None of those things existed. And suddenly the videos Eric had once proudly shared became evidence against him. Clips of dirty floors, broken appliances, moldy walls, images he brushed off as work in progress, now became markers of failure. Every frame that once boosted his views now undermined his credibility. So he shifted the story. He said the family was too far gone. He said the conditions were out of control. He said he needed help because he could no longer save them alone. But it wasn't the family collapsing. It was his narrative. His confession surprised even those who had doubted him from the beginning, because it revealed not just fear but motive. He admitted privately to several people that the situation got too big and too risky, that people were watching too closely, that he needed to distance himself before things got ugly. And nothing creates distance faster than calling the state. He knew what would happen the moment he made that call. He knew the state would come swiftly because of the family's history. He knew the trio, Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine, were vulnerable enough to be removed quickly. He knew the authorities would not question his concerns. He also knew no one would be able to challenge him immediately. Not Betty. Not Larry. Not the viewers who trusted him. Not even the family he claimed to be protecting. The confession didn't come all at once. It came piece by piece, slipped into conversations he didn't think would ever reach the public. He talked about legal pressure. He talked about people turning on him. He talked about doing what he had to do. But the most revealing part came when someone asked him the one question he never expected. If they were really in danger, why did you wait so long to report it? He froze, not physically but verbally. His answer was shaky, defensive, and brutally telling. I couldn't call sooner. Not while I was still involved. They would have blamed me for everything. Those words rippled online like a detonation. Because they revealed something Eric had tried to hide. He didn't believe the Whittakers were unsafe until the public started questioning him. The timeline made this confession even more damning. In the weeks leading up to the separation, there were no new incidents. No new reports of violence. No sudden deterioration. In fact, the videos from those weeks showed the family laughing, cooking, talking with visitors, and living almost exactly as they always had. The danger didn't increase. The criticism did. People started pointing out inconsistencies. They saw how Eric exaggerated certain stories. They saw how he contradicted himself. They saw how he used fear-based language only after donations slowed. And they kept asking the question he couldn't escape. What did you do with the money? That was the pressure point. That was the moment everything shifted. That was when his story transformed. Suddenly, the family wasn't just struggling, they were in peril. Suddenly, the house wasn't just run down, it was uninhabitable. Suddenly, the relatives weren't just flawed, they were dangerous. And suddenly he wasn't responsible, he was overwhelmed. It was a narrative that protected only one person, himself. He began distancing himself from Betty and Larry, claiming they weren't cooperative. He began warning people about BJ, even though no new incidents had occurred. He began reframing every moment of disorder as a red flag he had overlooked. By the time he made the call to Adult Protective Services, he had already started painting himself as the hero forced into an impossible situation. The one who tried everything. The one who cared too much. The one who finally had to do the right thing. But his confession revealed a different truth. He didn't call because the family needed saving. He called because he did. And the cost of that decision, emotionally, socially, and psychologically, was paid entirely by the Whittakers, not him. Timmy didn't understand why he was being pulled away from the porch swing he loved. Ray didn't understand the unfamiliar hands that guided him into a van. Lorraine didn't understand why her quiet world was suddenly loud and chaotic. They were confused, terrified, separated from the only stability they had ever known. And Eric, the man who changed their lives forever, walked away from the scene without a backward glance. Later, he told someone close to him, "If I didn't act when I did, the whole thing would have blown up on me. I had no other option." But he did. He had dozens of options. He had time. He had support. He had influence. The one thing he didn't have was patience or accountability. His confession did more than expose motive. It exposed the calculated nature of the separation, the timing, the framing, the sudden shift from helper to whistleblower. He wasn't pulling the family out of crisis. He was pulling himself out of suspicion. And in doing so, he destroyed the fragile balance that had kept the Whittakers together for decades. People who once defended him now ask a different question. Did Eric separate Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine because they were in danger, or because he was? Comment below. Do you believe Eric acted out of duty or self-preservation? The confession was only the first fracture. Once those words slipped out, "If I didn't act when I did, everything would have come back on me," the narrative Eric spent months constructing began to crumble. Behind his carefully curated live streams and emotional monologues lay a timeline far more tangled, far more revealing, and far more calculating than the version he fed the public. To understand why he separated Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine, you have to follow the events in the order they actually happened, not the order he later arranged them. Because the deeper people looked, the more obvious it became that the removal wasn't triggered by danger, but by exposure. It wasn't about protecting the family, but about protecting a position. And the story shifts dramatically once you lay out the private conversations, the unexplained gaps, and the decisions that preceded his call to Adult Protective Services. It began with the money. More specifically, with the moment people started noticing that the money wasn't going where he said it was. For months, donors believed every dollar sent to Eric was being used to improve the Whittakers' lives. He said it repeatedly. He promised transparency. But as time passed, the footage didn't match the claims. The house remained in ruins. The bathroom was never installed. The kitchen still looked like a disaster zone. The outdoor structures stayed broken, leaning, collapsing. And the new home, his biggest promise, was nowhere. Instead, viewers saw him traveling, dining out, replacing equipment, and boasting subtly about growing his platform. At first, he dismissed the questions as noise. But as pressure grew, so did his frustration. People weren't just asking politely, they were demanding accountability. They wanted proof. They wanted receipts. They wanted an answer to the question that quietly spread across his comment sections. Why hasn't anything changed? His tone shifted after that. He became more defensive, more emotional, more frantic. He lashed out at critics. He accused longtime supporters of turning against him. And then, almost overnight, he changed strategies entirely. Instead of answering questions about the money, he redirected attention to the family. Suddenly, every flaw in their household became urgent. Every issue became severe. Every concern became a crisis. He said the house was unlivable, yet he had filmed in it countless times without making that claim. He said the family was unsafe, yet he had reassured viewers for months that he had everything under control. He said he feared for their well-being, yet he continued creating content with them without reporting any danger. Nothing about the situation had changed except the level of scrutiny aimed at him. That was the first sign that his motives were shifting. The second came when his partnership with Patrick fell apart. Their feud wasn't just public, it was explosive. Both men accused each other of misusing donations, lying to viewers, and manipulating the family. Their friendship, once presented as a united front, disintegrated in real time. And the turbulence created by their conflict spilled into the household. The Whittakers didn't understand the online drama. They didn't know about the financial accusations. They didn't know their home had become the battleground for two men fighting for control over the same story. But Eric did. And so did Patrick. And each felt pressure to reclaim control, because whichever side the family favored held more credibility. During this period, several private conversations leaked, not recordings, but recollections from people who had direct contact with Eric. They described him as agitated, paranoid, convinced that Patrick was trying to flip the narrative against him. He said he felt betrayed. He said people were trying to drag him down. And he believed Patrick was feeding damaging information to state officials. In one conversation, he said something that now stands at the center of the controversy. If they blame me for the conditions, I'm done. They can pin everything on me, all the money, all the neglect, all of it. That sentence mattered because it revealed something he never admitted publicly. He knew the conditions could be used against him. He knew the cameras he loved could become evidence. He knew the family's vulnerability wasn't just a moral concern, it was a legal one. This realization opened a devastating truth. He feared the consequences not of what the family was living through, but of what people believed he had allowed. And from that fear grew his most drastic decision. The timeline became even sharper once people revisited the days leading up to the removal. The public had been told the call to APS was a sudden necessity, a response to an escalating emergency. But privately, Eric had predicted the separation days before it happened. He spoke of it casually, as if describing a logistical plan instead of a life-altering event. He said, "They'll probably need to be placed somewhere safer." He said, "I can't keep going back there like this." He said, "Once the state steps in, everything will settle." But nothing dangerous had happened during those days. No police reports. No new injuries. No documented threats. Nothing. Except the growing investigation into donation misuse. Except the feud with Patrick intensifying. Except the audience questioning his credibility. And then, in a moment that now looks painfully calculated, he made a strategic shift. He began speaking more dramatically about the family's vulnerabilities. He emphasized their disabilities in ways he had never done before. He described their emotional breakdowns. He painted the home as unmanageable. And then he presented himself as the one man who had carried the burden for too long. This rhetorical shift allowed him to reshape the narrative. If the situation looked dire enough, intervention would seem inevitable, and his role would look noble, not self-serving. By the time he picked up the phone and called Adult Protective Services, the story had already been rewritten. All the public saw was a man reluctantly making a difficult choice. All they heard was a trembling voice describing unbearable conditions. All they felt was empathy for a caretaker pushed beyond his limits. But behind closed doors, he had been preparing for this outcome long before he made that call. His confession later confirmed what the timeline already suggested. He wasn't acting out of sudden moral responsibility. He was acting because he felt the walls closing in. He believed that if the family remained in their home, the longer he stayed involved with them, the more likely it was that he would become the primary target of legal action. That realization reframed everything. The removal wasn't a reaction. It was a preemptive strike. A way to redirect the spotlight. A way to escape scrutiny. A way to distance himself before investigators or donors turned toward him fully. And the most heartbreaking part of the timeline was this. Before his call, no one, not Betty, not Larry, not Timmy, not Ray, not Lorraine, knew anything was going to happen. They had no warning. No time to prepare. No explanation. When the state vehicles arrived, the family believed it was another day of filming. Another check-in. Another round of charity or assistance. They didn't know the real purpose until officials stepped inside the yard. Witnesses who spoke privately said the moment the first official approached the door, Eric stepped back. He didn't greet them. He didn't intervene. He didn't advocate on the family's behalf. He simply watched from a distance. His confession later revealed why. He knew once the state took custody, he could wash his hands clean. He knew once they stepped in, they would take responsibility for every problem. He knew once the trio was removed, the story no longer rested on his shoulders. The call wasn't about saving the family. It was about saving himself. And in the process, the three most vulnerable members, who never understood the accusations, the live stream drama, the donation tension, the investigations, were the ones who paid the ultimate price. Comment below. Do you think Eric planned the removal long before he admitted it? The most revealing part of Eric's confession wasn't what he said, it was what he avoided saying. His words built a scaffold, but the truth hung in the empty spaces between them. To understand how the separation unfolded, you have to examine those silences, the messages he didn't show, the warnings he ignored, and the growing sense among people around him that he had crossed a line long before he ever called the state. Long before the removal, several individuals had contacted him with concerns that something felt off in his approach. These weren't haters or trolls. They were people who genuinely believed in his mission early on. They told him he was doing too much alone, taking on too much responsibility, and placing himself in a role he wasn't equipped to handle. Some warned him the situation was becoming emotionally unstable. Others urged him to involve state professionals sooner. And a few, in one way or another, hinted that the path he was on would eventually collide with legal oversight. But Eric brushed off every warning. He believed he had become the family's protector, the one person uniquely capable of guiding them. And as his platform grew, that belief hardened. The more praise he received, the more he convinced himself he was indispensable. Responsibility blurred into entitlement. Influence blurred into authority. And the family, with their limited understanding of what was happening behind the scenes, became pieces he rearranged in a story he controlled. This mindset made his downfall inevitable. Because the moment someone in his position begins confusing attention with impact and influence with expertise, everything begins to unravel. And for Eric, that unraveling accelerated once he realized the truth. The story he built wasn't his anymore. It was slipping out of his hands. Part of what triggered his panic was a series of private messages from viewers who claimed to have reported him to authorities. They weren't just criticizing him. They said they had contacted agencies, local law enforcement, and even financial regulators. Some threatened legal complaints. Some promised investigations. And whether those warnings were real or exaggerated, they got under his skin. He began talking publicly about haters, but privately he spoke about something far more specific: accountability. He feared being blamed for the family's conditions. He feared being held responsible for the lack of improvements. He feared the money trail would be examined too closely. And he feared that once investigators entered the picture, his entire narrative, every heartfelt speech, every emotional video, every promise, would collapse. It wasn't paranoia. It was the first moment he clearly understood the consequences of his actions. Around this time, people who had interacted with him during live streams began noticing a shift in his behavior. He appeared more anxious, more irritable, and more prone to sudden emotional outbursts. His tone oscillated between martyrdom and defensiveness. One moment he was crying about how much he sacrificed. The next he was lashing out at critics, painting himself as the victim of an ungrateful audience. Several longtime supporters said the same thing. He looked scared. Not scared for the family. Scared for himself. And then, as if on cue, he began laying a foundation for what he called inevitable change. He started speaking as though the family's situation was spiraling beyond his control. He described conditions that had existed for years as sudden emergencies. He framed ongoing challenges as newly explosive crises. And he began using a word he had never used publicly before: unmanageable. In hindsight, that word was telling. It signaled that he was preparing his audience, and perhaps himself, for the idea that he would soon not be involved. It created a narrative arc where stepping back could be framed as heartbreak instead of abandonment. But he wasn't stepping back, he was preparing to step away entirely. His messaging became more urgent when he realized Patrick was contacting people in their community. Patrick had started gathering his own evidence: screenshots of donations, inconsistencies in Eric's claims, conversations that contradicted what Eric told the public. And Patrick wasn't entirely trustworthy himself, but he knew the local terrain. He had connections. He had proximity. And he was close enough to the family to witness what Eric hoped would remain unseen. That unsettled Eric. According to a person who spoke with him during this period, he admitted privately, "If Patrick gets to them first, I'm the one who looks guilty." It was a rare moment of candid self-awareness. He wasn't worried about the truth, he was worried about whose truth would reach the public first. And in that fragile balance, he realized he could no longer control the narrative. Someone else was gathering receipts, gathering stories, gathering doubts. Someone else could expose him. This is where his confession becomes crucial. It wasn't a spontaneous admission of guilt. It was a calculated attempt to soften the story before others hardened it for him. By presenting himself as remorseful, overwhelmed, and emotionally broken, he hoped to frame the removal as a tragic necessity rather than a strategic escape. But behind that emotional display was a much more structured plan. Days before calling the state, he had already begun distancing himself. He posted less often. He stopped filming inside the house. He avoided showing private areas in the yard. He gradually removed himself from intimate moments with the family, shifting his footage towards generic conversations and outdoor shots. He was reducing his exposure, literally and figuratively. People who had been watching closely noticed the shift. It wasn't subtle. It was systematic. And then something strange happened. He began emphasizing his exhaustion. Almost every message included phrases like, "I'm drained," "I'm at my limit," "I'm only one man," "I've done everything I can." This emotional framing built up to one specific conclusion, that he had no choice but to involve professionals. Yet the reality, as later documented, was that he had not contacted any support services before that point. Not local disability support. Not mental health agencies. Not adult day programs. Not visiting nurse services. Not crisis organizations. Not any agency designed to ease caregiver burden. He went straight to the most extreme intervention, total removal. This bypassing of available support systems revealed something critical. He wasn't seeking help for the family. He was seeking a definitive endpoint for himself. Any lesser intervention would have required continued involvement, continued oversight, continued responsibility. Removal meant closure. It meant the story ended at someone else's doorstep. Even more revealing was the timing. The call came immediately after 3 developments. A viewer posted a detailed timeline of donation inconsistencies. A local resident reported seeing Eric arguing with someone on the property. A supporter publicly asked for financial transparency. These events hit within a 48-hour span. Within that same period, Eric made the call. The connection between scrutiny and action becomes impossible to ignore. If he had been motivated solely by concern for the family's well-being, he would have acted sooner. If the conditions were so dire, he would have contacted authorities months earlier. If the danger was immediate, he wouldn't have continued filming. But he acted only after he became the focal point of suspicion. When state officials arrived, the family was confused and frightened. Witnesses described Timmy clinging to Betty's arm, Ray pacing and grunting anxiously, and Lorraine refusing to leave the porch. They didn't understand what was happening, and in their fear, they looked toward the person they believed was there to help, Eric. But he didn't offer comfort. He didn't speak up. He didn't defend them. He remained physically present but emotionally distant, watching the scene unfold as though he were detached from it. Later, he described the moment as heartbreaking. But his detachment suggested something else, resignation. He knew this was coming. He had prepared for it. He had accepted the consequences for them, not for himself. After the removal, he didn't check on them. He didn't accompany the family to the facility. He didn't offer to help navigate the process. He didn't provide support to Betty or Larry in the aftermath. He withdrew completely. And when questioned, he said only one haunting line. "I did what I had to do." That phrase didn't describe a rescue. It described a survival tactic. What happened after the separation was not healing. It was not relief. It was not the quiet restoration Eric implied would follow his decision. What unfolded instead was a slow, aching collapse. One that exposed the depth of the damage he left behind and the irrevocable break he created between the family, the community, and the public that once watched with fascination. The first few days after Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine were taken were marked by a heavy, stunned silence on the property. Betty, who had always pushed through hardship with stubborn strength, seemed hollowed out. Her voice, once steady even in chaos, trembled whenever she spoke their names. She didn't understand why they were gone. She didn't understand where they were taken. She didn't understand what she had done wrong. Her grief wasn't loud. It was a kind of slow crumbling, an aging woman carrying questions she knew she would never get the answers to. Larry, who rarely showed emotion in front of others, reacted differently. He paced the yard. He argued with shadows. He repeated the same phrases like a man trying to rewrite time through repetition, They shouldn't have took him. They shouldn't have took him. His frustration wasn't the anger of a man who felt guilty. It was the helplessness of someone whose world had been rearranged without warning, without explanation, and without a path to undoing it. The home itself changed too. For years, its flaws were overshadowed by the routines of the people who lived inside it. But with 3 bodies gone, the house felt bigger, emptier, and older. It creaked differently. The rooms felt colder. The silence inside wasn't peaceful. It felt like abandonment, like the echoes of voices that weren't coming back. Public reactions split sharply. Some viewers praised Eric as heroic, convinced he had rescued the 3 from squalor. Others condemned him as manipulative, a man who played savior for the camera and executioner behind the scenes. And a third group, the quiet observers, simply felt uneasy. It was too fast, too abrupt, too clean. The timing didn't align with the narrative he presented. And the more people examined the truth, the more the story shifted away from protection and towards something far more troubling: self-preservation disguised as morality. Behind the scenes, local authorities noted something Eric never addressed openly. Once the family was taken, APS and law enforcement attempted to follow up with him for additional information. He didn't respond. Not to calls. Not to emails. Not even through the social media accounts he once used daily. He had inserted himself into the most vulnerable part of their lives, initiated a state-level intervention, and then severed all ties the moment they were removed. It was exactly the kind of disappearance a guilty man orchestrates when he knows the consequences no longer sit on his shoulders. The emotional burden, the confusion, the fear, the bureaucratic maze, all of that landed squarely on Betty and Larry. They didn't know how to navigate state systems. They didn't have transportation, legal knowledge, or formal education. They didn't even understand the terminology used in the paperwork they received later, long after the removal. And there was no one to translate it for them. No advocate. No social worker guiding them step by step. Certainly not Eric. For them, the removal felt like a punishment for surviving the only way they knew how. Meanwhile, in facilities far from the mountain road they once walked every day, the 3 adults experienced their own form of disorientation. The sudden change from familiarity to white walls, scheduled meals, clipped voices, and rotating staff was not a transition, it was a shock. Their disabilities made the adjustment harder, not easier. The routines they understood were gone. The faces they trusted were absent. Their environment shifted so drastically it might as well have been another country. State care offered safety, structure, and hygiene, but it did not offer emotional continuity. It couldn't. The system was built to preserve bodies, not memories. To provide basic functioning, not comfort. To document behavior, not history. And so, the 3 who had lived decades defined by rhythm and repetition entered a world where nothing was predictable, no one spoke in ways they understood, and the people who had been their anchors vanished overnight. The tragedy is not that they were placed in care. The tragedy is how it happened. Abruptly. Without preparation. Without compassion. Without acknowledgement of what such a transition would do to their internal world. And all the while, Eric spoke of guilt, of heartbreak, of burden, but he never spoke of responsibility. To him, the removal was the end of a chapter. To the family, it was the beginning of a wound that would never fully close. His confession, when it finally came, was framed as transparency. But it sounded like a performance meant to soften the image of a man who had already made his exit. He talked about failing the family, but not about the ways he used them. He talked about emotional weight, but not about the financial inconsistencies. He talked about fear, but not about what, or who, he was actually afraid of. The truth is that he confessed not to unburden himself, but to reshape the narrative before others could do it for him. It was a strategy, not an awakening. A controlled burn designed to prevent a wildfire he saw coming. And when the smoke began to clear, the only people left coughing in the ashes were Betty and Larry. In the end, the separation became a symbol of everything wrong with the way their story had been handled. Outsiders came not as helpers, but as curators. They framed the family's suffering to suit their platforms. They used them for emotional engagement, for content, for income, for influence. And when the consequences arrived, those outsiders slipped away through cracks the Whittakers never saw coming. The most painful truth is this. The family lost 3 people in a single day. The public lost interest in a single week. And Eric lost nothing at all. But the story doesn't fade there. It lingers in every unanswered question, every empty room, every desperate attempt Betty made to learn where her loved ones were taken. Every moment Lorraine, Timmy, or Ray sat in a new environment wondering why the people they trusted stopped coming. What Eric set in motion can't be undone. What he confessed can't rewrite what he did. And what the family endured continues, long after his camera turned away. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.